The air in the Velara research station tasted of antiseptic and something metallic, like licking a battery. Daniel Kane thought as consciousness returned to him in waves. The sterile labs and glass-walled corridors gleamed under the unforgiving white lights that never dimmed, never changed, creating an eternal day that had long since confused his circadian rhythm. He tried to lift his hand to rub his eyes, but the restraints held firm. Again. Always. His wrists remained secured to the examination table, the same as every morning for... How long had it been? Weeks? Months? The days had begun to blur together in this pristine prison of science. Subject appears to be regaining consciousness. A cool, measured voice announced from somewhere beyond his field of vision. Vital signs stable. Cognitive functions normal. Daniel didn't bother to turn his head toward the voice. He knew it belonged to Sistema, the lead analyst assigned to his case. Her clinical detachment had become as familiar as the restraints that bit into his skin. "I told you. I have a name," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. "It's Daniel, not Subject." A soft scoff came from the corner of the room. That would be Rainey, Sistema's sister and official observer of the trials. Where Sistema was all cool efficiency, Rainey was sharp edges and barely concealed disdain. "The subject continues to insist on personal designation," Rainey noted, the tap of her stylus against her datapad punctuating each word. "Perhaps we should consider a more compliant candidate for the final phase." Daniel finally turned his head, catching sight of the two women standing side by side at the monitoring station. They shared the same tall, willowy build and silver-white hair that marked them as Velmerans. But where Sistema's features held a certain softness, a hint of curiosity behind her professional mask, Rainey's face was all angles and judgment. Sistema's fingers danced across the holographic display. "Subject D37, Daniel, has progressed further than any previous candidate. Replacing him now would set the project back by months." "Look at him," Rainey insisted, gesturing dismissively in his direction. "He's too small. The genetic compatibility markers are marginal at best. We need someone who can withstand the final trials." Daniel felt a flush of anger rise to his cheeks. At 5'10", he wasn't exactly short by human standards, but the Velmerans towered over most Earthborn humans. Their enhanced genetics had made them taller, stronger, and by their own estimation, superior. It was one of the many reasons they treated humans like himself as little more than laboratory specimens. "I can hear you. You know," Daniel called out, forcing a smile he didn't feel. "And I'm actually quite comfortable with my size. It's not about how big you are, but how you use what you've got." Sistema's eyes widened slightly at his innuendo. A flash of something, embarrassment, interest, crossing her face before she schooled her features back into professional neutrality. Rainey, however, looked as though she'd just tasted something sour. "Impertinence is not a desirable trait," Rainey muttered, making another note on her pad. Sistema stepped away from the console and approached Daniel's table. Her white lab coat rustled softly as she moved. Up close, he could see the faint lavender tint to her irises, another Velmeran trait, and the slight furrow between her brows as she studied him. "We will begin today's trials in 10 minutes, she informed him, her voice softer than when she spoke to her sister. "The parameters have been adjusted to account for your physiology." Daniel met her gaze steadily. "And if I refuse?" The question hung in the air between them. In the 6 weeks he'd been at the station, he had never openly refused a test. Complained? Yes. Made sarcastic comments? Certainly. But direct defiance was new territory. Sistema blinked, clearly unprepared for this development. "Refusal is not an option within the parameters of your agreement." "Agreement?" Daniel laughed, the sound harsh even to his own ears. "Is that what we're calling coercion these days?" From the corner, Rainey approached, her tall frame casting a shadow over him. The subject signed all necessary documentation prior to transfer to Valara Station. His consent is legally binding. Daniel's jaw clenched. I signed to participate in mutually beneficial genetic research, not to be treated like a lab rat without basic dignity. Sistema's eyes flickered to the monitors displaying his vital signs, which had begun to spike with his rising anger. What would you consider basic dignity in this context? The question surprised him. It was the first time either of the sisters had asked for his input on anything. For starters, not being restrained 24/7, being addressed by my name, and knowing what these tests are actually for, beyond vague mentions of compatibility research. Rainey stepped forward, clearly intending to shut down this line of conversation. But Sistema raised a hand to stop her. The restraints are a safety protocol, Sistema explained. As for the purpose of our research, she hesitated, glancing at her sister. Rainey's mouth tightened into a thin line. That information is classified. Daniel looked between them, sensing a tension that went beyond their professional relationship. There was something personal at stake here, something that made Rainey particularly invested in maintaining the rigid protocols. Release the restraints, Sistema said suddenly, turning to the control panel. What? Rainey's voice rose sharply. Absolutely not. Protocol clearly states, I am the lead analyst on this project, Sistema cut in, her voice taking on an edge of authority that Daniel hadn't heard before. And I assess that the psychological benefits of allowing the subject limited mobility outweigh the minimal security risks. With a series of soft clicks, the restraints around Daniel's wrists and ankles retracted into the table. He sat up slowly, rubbing at the red marks they had left behind, watching the sisters carefully. Rainey's posture had gone rigid, her hands clenched at her sides. This is a violation of protocol. I will be noting it in my report. Sistema didn't look at her sister as she handed Daniel a simple white tunic. Put this on. Today's first test will require full upper body exposure. Daniel took the garment but made no move to put it on. What exactly am I being tested for? What kind of compatibility are we talking about? The sisters exchanged another loaded glance, and Daniel caught something in their eyes that sent a chill down his spine. There was more happening here than mere scientific curiosity. The specifics are not relevant to your participation, Rainey said coldly. Put on the tunic and prepare for the tactile response assessment. Daniel looked down at the thin fabric in his hands, then back up at the women. He had been compliant for 6 weeks, hoping that cooperation would eventually earn him better treatment, maybe even information about when he might be released. But the endless tests had only become more invasive, more personal, and he was no closer to understanding why he was really here. In that moment, something shifted inside him. If they wouldn't give him answers, he would force their hand. No, he said simply, dropping the tunic onto the table. Rainey's eyebrows shot up. Excuse me. I said no. Daniel swung his legs over the side of the table, feeling the cold floor beneath his bare feet. I'm not doing any more tests until you tell me exactly what you're looking for and why I'm here. Rainey's face flushed with anger. This is unacceptable. Sistema, reinstate the restraints immediately. But Sistema was watching Daniel with an odd expression, part concern, part something else he couldn't quite identify. Perhaps we should... No. Rainey cut her off sharply. We do not negotiate with test subjects. If he won't comply voluntarily, we'll proceed with involuntary protocols. Daniel stood his ground, heart pounding. He had no idea what involuntary protocols entailed, but he suspected it wouldn't be pleasant. Still, he'd reached his breaking point. Go ahead, he challenged, lifting his chin. But whatever data you collect under duress will be compromised. I'll fight every step of the way, and you know it. Sistema stepped between them, her back to Daniel as she faced her sister. "Rainey," she said quietly. "A moment in private." The two women moved to the far corner of the lab, their voices dropping to whispers. Daniel couldn't make out their words, but the tension in their postures was clear. Rainey gesticulated sharply, while Sistema remained still, responding with short, measured statements that seemed to only agitate her sister further. Finally, they returned. Sistema's face was composed, but there was a new resolve in her eyes. "We will initiate Trial Alpha 3, she announced. Rainey's head snapped toward her sister. "That protocol isn't scheduled until—" "I am adjusting the schedule," Sistema interrupted. "The subject has demonstrated the necessary psychological parameters to proceed." Daniel looked between them, unease growing in his stomach. "What's Trial Alpha 3? Sistema met his eyes directly. "It is a comprehensive compatibility assessment that will answer many of your questions. But I must warn you, it is significantly more intense than anything you have experienced thus far." "And if I agree to this, you'll tell me what all this is really about?" "Yes," Sistema nodded. "Upon completion, you will be fully briefed on the purpose of your presence here." Daniel considered his options. He could continue to refuse, but that would likely lead to the involuntary protocols Rainey had threatened. Or he could take this opportunity to finally get some answers, even if it meant enduring whatever this trial Alpha 3 entailed. "Fine," he said at last. "I'll do it." Rainey's eyes narrowed, but she made no further objection. Instead, she turned to the control panel and began entering a complex sequence of commands. "Prepare the heat chamber," Sistema instructed, "and bring the neural sync equipment." As Rainey worked, Sistema approached Daniel again. She lowered her voice, speaking so only he could hear. "This trial is not in your official participation agreement," she admitted. "You have the right to refuse." Daniel studied her face, searching for some clue to her motives. "But you want me to do it?" It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway. "Yes." "Why?" Sistema hesitated, then said simply, "Because I need to know." "Know what?" Before she could answer, Rainey called from across the room. "The heat chamber is ready. Bring the subject." Sistema straightened, the brief moment of intimacy gone. "This way," she said, gesturing toward a door that Daniel had never been through before. He followed her, hyper-aware of Rainey, watching his every move from behind. The door slid open to reveal a small, circular chamber with mirrored walls. In the center stood two platforms, each surrounded by a complex array of sensors and monitoring equipment. "Remove your clothing and step onto the left platform," Sistema instructed, her clinical tone back in place. Daniel hesitated. "All of it?" "Complete nudity is required for accurate biometric readings," she confirmed, not meeting his eyes. This was far from the first time they had required him to strip for tests. But something about this chamber, with its mirrors reflecting his image back at him from every angle, made him feel more exposed than ever. "And what about you?" he asked, noticing the second platform. "I will be participating in this trial as the control subject," Sistema explained. She turned to Rainey, who had followed them in. "You will monitor from the observation room. No intervention unless life signs become critical." Rainey's expression darkened. "This is highly irregular." "Your objection is noted," Sistema replied coolly. "Now, please take your position in observation." With obvious reluctance, Rainey left the chamber. A moment later, her face appeared on a small screen mounted on the wall. "Monitors active, commencing baseline recordings." Daniel stood awkwardly, still fully clothed. "I don't suppose there's any privacy for the, disrobing part." A faint smile touched Sistema's lips. "The entirety of your physiology has been cataloged extensively over the past 6 weeks. Daniel, modesty at this stage seems somewhat redundant." Despite everything, he found himself chuckling. Fair point. He began to remove his simple garments, the loose pants and shirt that were all they had allowed him since his arrival. As he undressed, Sistema did the same, efficiently unfastening her lab coat and the fitted uniform beneath. Daniel tried not to stare, but it was impossible not to notice the subtle differences between Velmarin and human physiology. The faint, silvery patterns on her skin that seemed to shimmer under the lights. The slightly elongated torso. The perfect symmetry of her features. They stepped onto their respective platforms, facing each other. Daniel fought the urge to cover himself with his hands, instead standing straight, refusing to show discomfort. The heat chamber will gradually increase in temperature, Sistema explained. The purpose is to measure our biological responses under stress and determine compatibility patterns. Compatibility for what exactly? Daniel pressed. Sistema's eyes met his. For bonding. Before he could ask what she meant by bonding, the chamber hummed to life. The floor beneath his feet began to warm, and the air around them thickened noticeably. Initiating thermal sequence, Rainey's voice announced from the monitor. Current chamber temperature, 22 degrees Celsius. Target temperature, 45 degrees Celsius. Estimated time to completion, 20 minutes. Daniel felt the first beads of sweat forming on his brow. 45 degrees. That's dangerously hot for humans. Your limits have been carefully calculated, Sistema assured him, though he noticed she didn't seem entirely confident. The trial will cease if your vital signs indicate genuine distress. The temperature continued to rise steadily. At 30 degrees, both of them were sweating freely. At 35, Daniel's heart rate had increased significantly, and he could see Sistema's chest rising and falling more rapidly as well. Physiological responses synchronized at 67%, Rainey reported, her voice tight with what sounded like displeasure. Continuing thermal increase. By 40 degrees, Daniel was struggling. His vision had begun to blur at the edges, and his legs trembled with the effort of remaining standing. Across from him, Sistema appeared to be faring better, but her silver-white skin had flushed a deep lavender, and her breathing had become labored. Human subject approaching tolerance threshold, Rainey noted. Recommend termination of trial. Continue, Sistema countered, her voice strained. We're approaching the critical data point. Daniel swayed on his platform. What data point? He managed to ask through parched lips. Instead of answering, Sistema stepped off her platform and moved toward him. This clearly wasn't part of the protocol, because Rainey's voice immediately cut through the humid air. Sistema, return to your designated position immediately. Sistema ignored her sister. She reached out and placed her hands on Daniel's shoulders to steady him. The touch of her skin against his sent an electric sensation through his body that had nothing to do with the heat. What are you doing? He whispered. Testing a theory, she replied, her voice barely audible. Her hands slid down his arms, leaving trails of coolness in their wake. Wherever she touched him, the unbearable heat seemed to recede, replaced by a tingling energy that spread through his limbs. Chamber temperature at 43 degrees Celsius, Rainey announced, alarm evident in her tone. Sistema, this is a direct violation of protocol. Return to your platform now. But Sistema's focus remained entirely on Daniel. Her eyes, now a deep violet from the heat, searched his face. Do you feel it? She asked urgently. And he did feel it. A connection forming between them, as tangible as the heat pressing in from all sides. Where their skin touched, a strange resonance seemed to vibrate, like two tuning forks finding the same frequency. What is this? He asked, his voice rough. Biosynchronicity, she answered. The very thing we've been testing for. The ability of two distinct genetic codes to harmonize and create a shared biological response. On the monitor, Rainey was frantically typing commands. Terminating trial! Safety override initiated! But nothing happened. The chamber continued to heat up, the air now so thick it felt like breathing through wet cotton. The system isn't responding. Rainey's panicked voice came through. Something's blocking the override! Daniel's knees buckled, and Sistema caught him, easing them both to the floor of the chamber. The metal surface burned against his skin, but her touch continued to provide islands of relief. Chamber temperature at 45 degrees Celsius, Rainey reported. Critical threshold reached. Life support systems failing. Through his delirium, Daniel realized what was happening. The chamber wasn't malfunctioning. It was being pushed beyond its safety parameters deliberately. And given the panic in Rainey's voice, it wasn't her doing. You sabotaged it, he gasped, looking at Sistema with newfound understanding. Why? Her hands framed his face, cooling his feverish skin. Because some questions can only be answered without observation, without protocol. The room spun around him as his body fought against the extreme heat. He knew he was approaching the limits of human endurance. And yet, where Sistema touched him, he felt strength returning, as though she were somehow sharing her own resilience with him. I can't maintain the connection much longer, she whispered, her own strength clearly failing. Your human physiology, it's too different. Daniel forced his eyes to focus on her face. In this moment of crisis, with all pretense of clinical detachment stripped away, he saw her clearly for the first time, not as his captor or researcher, but as someone seeking connection, answers to questions that went beyond science. Acting on instinct, he raised his hand to her face, mirroring her gesture. As his palm connected with her cheek, a surge of energy passed between them, stronger than before. Her eyes widened in shock. That's not possible, she breathed. Humans shouldn't be able to initiate the energy transfer. Daniel didn't understand the science of what was happening, but he understood the feeling, like completing a circuit, like finding a missing piece of himself he hadn't known was lost. On the monitor, Rainey was shouting now, her composed demeanor completely abandoned. Emergency protocols activated, attempting manual override of chamber seals. The temperature had stabilized at 45 degrees, but Daniel knew they couldn't survive much longer at this heat. Already, his consciousness was beginning to fade at the edges, darkness creeping into his vision. Sistema, he managed, his voice barely a whisper. Whatever you're trying to prove, is it worth dying for? Her eyes locked with his. It's not about proving, she said. It's about feeling, experiencing, being more than just an observer of life. And then, as his vision began to tunnel, and his grip on consciousness slipped, she did something entirely outside of any scientific protocol. She leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. Where before, there had been a trickle of energy between them, now there was a flood. Power surged through Daniel's body, driving back the effects of the heat, clearing his mind, strengthening his failing limbs. He could feel Sistema's heartbeat as clearly as his own, could sense her thoughts at the edges of his consciousness, like whispers just beyond hearing. This was what she had meant by bonding, not some clinical biological compatibility, but a true melding of beings, a connection that transcended their differences. On the screen, Rainey's face had gone completely still, her eyes wide with shock as she witnessed what was happening. In that moment, Daniel knew she was seeing something unprecedented, something that challenged everything the Velmerans thought they knew about humans. The kiss deepened, driven not by passion, but by survival, by the discovery of this unexpected connection. Daniel's arms wrapped around Sistema, pulling her closer, strengthening the flow of energy between them. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the crisis was over. The chamber hissed loudly as emergency vents opened, releasing the superheated air. Cold oxygen flooded in, and the temperature began to drop rapidly. Sistema pulled back, her breathing ragged, her eyes still locked with Daniel's. Between them hung 1,000 unasked questions, 1,000 unspoken revelations. Chamber stabilizing at 25 degrees Celsius. Rainey's voice came through the speaker, unnaturally calm now. Life signs. Normalizing. Trial Alpha 3 is concluded. But Daniel knew that what had just happened went far beyond any trial or experiment. Whatever data they had been collecting, the experience itself had changed something fundamental between him and Sistema, and possibly, given the look on Rainey's face before the screen went dark, changed something in their understanding of humans altogether. Sistema stood on shaky legs, extending a hand to help him up. As their palms met, the connection flared again, though less intensely than before. "We should return to the main lab," she said quietly. "There will be protocols to follow." Daniel nodded, too exhausted to argue. As they gathered their clothes and dressed in silence, he wondered what would happen next. Would they explain what had occurred? Would they finally tell him why he was really here? Or would they simply note the results in their clinical reports and move on to the next test, the next violation of his humanity? But one thing had become clear in that superheated chamber. He was not merely a test subject to Sistema anymore. And whatever the Velmarans had been searching for in their human compatibility studies, they had found something they never expected in him. As they stepped back into the main laboratory, Rainey was waiting for them. Her face was composed once more, but a new wariness lurked in her eyes as she looked at Daniel. "The biosync readings were unprecedented," she said stiffly. "We'll need to run additional analyses before proceeding." Sistema nodded, not meeting her sister's gaze. "I'll prepare the report." "No," Rainey said sharply. "I think it's best if I handle the official documentation for this particular trial. You should rest." Her eyes flickered between Sistema and Daniel, and he could see her reassessing everything she thought she knew about both of them. "As you wish," Sistema agreed, her voice neutral. But as Rainey turned away to the monitoring station, she glanced at Daniel, a silent communication passing between them. Whatever had happened in that chamber, it wasn't over. It was only beginning. The rest of the day passed in a blur of tests, more conventional this time, with Rainey overseeing everything personally, while Sistema worked quietly at her station. Blood draws, reflex tests, cognitive assessments, all familiar routines from the previous weeks, but now tinged with a new significance that no one was acknowledging openly. By evening, Daniel was exhausted, his body still recovering from the strain of the heat chamber. When they finally returned him to his small living quarters, a sterile room with little more than a bed and basic facilities, he collapsed onto the mattress, too tired even to wonder about the implications of what had happened. Sleep claimed him almost instantly, but it was far from restful. His dreams were filled with heat and light, with Sistema's touch and the strange energy that had flowed between them. He woke several times, gasping, his body remembering the sensation of nearly cooking alive in that chamber. During one such awakening, in the darkest part of the night, he became aware that he was not alone. A figure stood in the shadows by the door. He sat up quickly, heart pounding. "Who's there?" "It's me," Sistema's voice came softly. She stepped forward, the faint emergency lighting illuminating her features. She had abandoned her lab coat and uniform, dressed instead in a simple silver-gray tunic that fell to her knees. "How did you get in here?" Daniel asked, suddenly very conscious of his own state of undress beneath the thin sheet. "I overrode the security protocols," she said simply, as though it were nothing unusual. "We need to talk, and we can't do it where Rainey can hear." Daniel shifted to make room as she sat on the edge of his bed, in the dim light, with her professional armor stripped away. She looked younger, more vulnerable. "What happened today?" she began, then stopped, seeming to search for words. "It wasn't supposed to be possible." "The bond thing?" Daniel prompted. She nodded. "Biosynchronicity has only ever been documented between Velmarans. It's the foundation of our pair bonding, what you might call marriage, though it goes much deeper than that. The ability to share energy, to stabilize each other's biological systems under stress. It's a key part of our evolutionary adaptation to this planet's harsh environment. Daniel processed this information slowly. So, when you said you were testing for compatibility, we were investigating whether humans could form similar bonds with Velmarans, she confirmed. The genetic modifications that created our species altered our biology significantly. The working theory was that humans, as our genetic ancestors, might retain some capacity for synchronization. But no one had proven it before today, Daniel guessed. Sistema's eyes met his, gleaming like amethysts in the low light. No human test subject has ever initiated an energy transfer. At best, they've been passive recipients, able to absorb, but not to give. What you did, she shook her head in wonder. It changes everything we thought we knew about human potential. Daniel absorbed this, trying to fit it into the larger picture. Is that why I'm here? To see if humans and Velmarans can… What, mate? A faint flush colored her cheeks. Not in the reproductive sense. Velmarans and humans cannot produce offspring together. But in terms of forming pair bonds, yes. There has been growing concern about the limited genetic diversity within our population. Finding compatible partners outside our species could be crucial for our future social stability. So I'm basically part of an interspecies dating experiment, Daniel said dryly. To his surprise, Sistema laughed, a genuine sound of amusement he had never heard from her before. That is a rather reductive way of putting it, but not entirely inaccurate. The moment of levity faded, and Daniel's thoughts turned to more serious implications. If what happened today is so groundbreaking, why keep it secret? Why the sabotage? The off-record trial? Sistema's expression grew somber. Because not everyone on Valara believes this research should be pursued. There are those who consider any mingling with humans to be degrading, a step backward in our evolution. Like Rainey, Daniel said, understanding dawning. She nodded. My sister is brilliant, but traditional. She sees humans as genetically inferior, useful for study but not for true connection. She's here to ensure the research stays within very narrow parameters. And you don't agree? I believe in following the evidence wherever it leads, Sistema said carefully. And I believe that true advancement comes from connection, not isolation. She hesitated, then added more softly. What I didn't expect was to find myself personally invested in the outcome. The admission hung in the air between them, charged with implications. Daniel felt a tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with the lingering effects of the heat chamber. So what happens now? He asked. Tomorrow, we begin a new phase of testing, she explained. More intimate biosync trials, to see if we can replicate today's results under controlled conditions. With Rainey watching our every move, Daniel noted. Sistema's lips curved in a small, secretive smile. Not entirely. I've convinced her that some privacy is necessary for optimal results. The monitoring will be minimal. Daniel studied her face, trying to understand what she wasn't saying. What are you really planning, Sistema? She reached out, her fingertips lightly touching his hand. Even that small contact sent a ripple of energy between them, a ghost of the powerful connection they had shared in the chamber. I'm planning to discover the truth, she said simply. About what's possible between us, between our species. No protocols, no predetermined parameters, just authentic exploration. The implications made Daniel's pulse quicken. And if Rainey finds out? She'll object, strenuously. Sistema's expression hardened slightly. But I am still the lead researcher on this project. My sister may be the observer, but the final decisions are mine. Daniel wasn't entirely convinced. In the weeks he'd been at the station, he'd seen enough of the sisters' dynamic to know that Rainey wielded considerable influence, both professionally and personally. Sistema might be the nominal leader, but she often deferred to her more forceful sister. Why risk it? He asked. Why put your position, maybe even your career, on the line for this? Sistema was quiet for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Because for the first time since I became a scientist, I've found something that makes me want to be more than an observer of life. I want to be a participant. The honesty of her answer struck him deeply. In that moment, he saw not the cool, detached scientist who had presided over weeks of invasive tests, but a woman caught between worlds, between the rigid structures of her society and the unexpected feelings awakening within her. Without thinking, he reached up to touch her face, his fingers tracing the delicate silver patterns on her cheek. The connection flared between them again, stronger this time, as though their bodies remembered the path energy had taken before and found it more easily now. I'm still your prisoner, he reminded her gently. Her eyes closed briefly at his touch, then opened to meet his gaze directly. Not anymore, she said. After today's results, you've fulfilled the terms of your research contract. You're free to leave Valara whenever you choose. The news should have filled him with relief, with joy at the prospect of finally escaping this sterile prison. Instead, he felt a strange reluctance, a pulling in two directions at once. And if I choose to stay, to continue the research? Then it would be as a voluntary participant, she said, with full disclosure of all protocols, the right to refuse any test, and, she hesitated, appropriate compensation. I don't want compensation, Daniel said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. I want the truth, about everything that's happening here, about this connection between us, about what it means. Sistema's lips parted slightly, as though she wanted to say more but couldn't find the words. Instead, she leaned forward slowly, giving him time to pull away if he wished.
He didn't.
Their lips met in a kiss that was nothing like the desperate connection in the heat chamber. This was gentle, exploratory, a question rather than a necessity. Yet the energy still flowed between them, a warm current that made his skin tingle and his heart race. When she finally pulled back, her eyes were wide with wonder. The effect persists, even without external stress, she murmured, more to herself than to him. The bond is still forming. Before Daniel could respond, a soft chime sounded from the device at Sistema's wrist. She glanced at it, her expression shifting back toward professional concern. I have to go, she said, rising from the bed. Rainey has called an early meeting to discuss today's results. If I'm not in my quarters when she checks? Daniel nodded, understanding the need for caution. Will I see you tomorrow? Yes, she promised. For the new trials. But remember, officially, you're just another test subject. What happens between us when we're alone must remain private. At least for now. I understand, he assured her. I'm good at keeping secrets. She smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her face, making her look younger and lighter. Rest well, Daniel. Tomorrow will be illuminating. After she left, slipping out as silently as she had entered, Daniel lay awake for a long time, his mind racing with new possibilities. For 6 weeks, he had been nothing but a specimen to be studied, a set of biological responses to be measured and recorded. Now, suddenly, he was something else, a partner in discovery, a key to unlocking mysteries that went beyond simple science. And Sistema. She was no longer just his captor, his researcher. She was becoming something he had no name for yet, something that existed in the energy that flowed between them when they touched. He fell asleep eventually, and this time, his dreams were not of heat and desperation, but of silver patterns on pale skin and violet eyes that saw him, truly saw him, for the first time. Morning came too soon, announced by the automatic brightening of the lights in his quarters. Daniel rose and prepared himself for whatever the day might bring, his stomach tight with anticipation. When the door slid open, it was Rainey who stood there, not Sistema. Her tall frame filled the doorway, her expression as cold and unreadable as ever. "Good morning, subject," she said, the deliberate use of the impersonal designation making it clear where they stood with each other. "Today's trials will commence in 30 minutes. Prepare yourself." Daniel bit back the urge to correct her. Let her call him subject if it made her feel more in control. He knew now that he was much more than that, both to himself and to Sistema. "Where is Sistema?" he asked instead. Rainey's eyes narrowed slightly. "The lead analyst is preparing the equipment for today's procedures. You will see her in the laboratory." There was something in her tone that put Daniel on edge, a subtle note of suspicion, or perhaps knowledge. Had she discovered Sistema's nocturnal visit? Or was he just projecting his own anxiety onto her habitually stern demeanor? He followed her through the familiar corridors of the research station, noting for the first time how few other people they encountered. In 6 weeks, he had seen perhaps a dozen other Velmerans, always at a distance, always busy with their own research. It was as though this entire wing of the station had been dedicated to this single project, to him. The laboratory looked different today. The central examination table had been replaced by what appeared to be 2 reclining chairs, positioned face to face. Between them stood a complex apparatus of sensors and monitors, more sophisticated than anything he had seen before. Sistema was there, making final adjustments to the equipment. She looked up as they entered, and though her face remained professionally neutral, Daniel caught the flash of warmth in her eyes when they met his. "Good morning, Daniel," she said, using his name pointedly. "I trust you rested well after yesterday's exertion." "Well enough," he replied, matching her casual tone while searching her face for any clue to what she was planning. Rainey moved to a monitoring station at the far end of the room. "All systems are calibrated for the biosync trial," she reported. "Subject vital signs are within normal parameters." "Excellent," Sistema nodded. "Daniel, please take the seat on the left. I'll explain the procedure as we prepare." He did as instructed, settling into the contoured chair that seemed designed to cradle his body perfectly. As he leaned back, sensors automatically adjusted to press against his temples, wrists, and chest. Sistema took the opposite chair, the same sensors positioning themselves against her silver-tinted skin. "Today's trial is designed to measure and potentially enhance the biosynchronicity we observed yesterday," she explained, her voice steady and professional. "The equipment will provide real-time feedback on our energy exchange and guide us toward optimal synchronization patterns." On the large display screen visible from both chairs, complex waveforms appeared, one blue, one violet, alongside numerical data that meant nothing to Daniel. "The blue pattern represents your biological rhythms," Sistema continued. "The violet is mine. When synchronization occurs, the patterns will align and eventually merge." Daniel glanced over at Rainey, who was watching them with intense concentration. "And what exactly do we do to cause this synchronization?" "Physical contact is the primary catalyst," Sistema said, extending her hands palm up on the armrests between them. "We'll begin with simple touch and progress as the data indicates." Daniel placed his hands on hers, and immediately the sensors registered the contact. On the screen, the blue and violet waveforms pulsed and shifted, moving slightly closer together. "Baseline connection established," Rainey noted. "Energy transfer at 12% efficiency." Sistema's fingers curled around his, strengthening the contact. "Focus on the feeling of energy moving between us," she instructed quietly. "Visualize it as a current flowing from your core to mine and back again." Daniel closed his eyes, concentrating on the sensation. It was subtler than the desperate connection they had formed in the heat chamber, but still perceptible, a gentle humming that began where their skin touched and spread up his arms, into his chest. "Transfer efficiency increasing," Rainey reported, a note of surprise in her voice. 20%, 25%. "Very good," Sistema murmured. "Now, let's increase the contact surface area." She released his hands and leaned forward in her chair. Daniel did the same, meeting her halfway. She placed her palms against his cheeks, and instinctively, he mirrored the gesture, cradling her face in his hands. The effect was immediate. The humming intensified, spreading throughout his entire body now. On the screen, the waveforms lurched closer together, overlapping in places. 40% efficiency, Rainey announced, no longer able to keep the amazement from her voice. 45. 50%. Daniel opened his eyes to find Sistema's violet gaze fixed on his, intense and searching. In this moment of connection, it felt as though they were communicating without words, sharing thoughts and feelings directly through the energy flowing between them. "The human is actively contributing to the energy exchange," Rainey observed, her tone shifting from amazement to something closer to concern. "This contradicts all previous data on human-Velmeran interaction." Sistema didn't look away from Daniel as she responded. "Perhaps our previous methods were flawed. Perhaps we never gave the humans a true opportunity to participate as equals." The implied criticism was not lost on Rainey. From the corner of his eye, Daniel saw her stiffen. "The protocols were designed with scientific rigor," she countered. "Equality was not a relevant factor in biological research." "And yet," Sistema said softly, still looking at Daniel, "it appears to be a crucial factor in biosynchronicity." The tension between the sisters was palpable, but Daniel remained focused on the connection growing between him and Sistema. The longer they maintained contact, the stronger it became, until he began to sense not just the flow of energy, but flickers of emotion. Sistema's excitement, her curiosity, and beneath it all, a longing that mirrored his own. "We should progress to the next level of contact," Sistema suggested, her voice taking on a husky quality that had nothing to do with scientific inquiry. Rainey's head snapped up. "The protocol calls for a minimum of 30 minutes at each contact level before progression." "The data supports acceleration," Sistema countered, finally breaking her gaze from Daniel's to glance at the screen. The waveforms were now overlapping substantially, pulsing in near unison. "We're already achieving synchronization levels that weren't projected until much later in the trial sequence." For a moment, it seemed Rainey might continue to object, but then she pressed her lips together and made a notation on her pad. "Proceed to level 3 contact," she said stiffly. "But I am registering my concerns about protocol deviation." Sistema turned back to Daniel, a faint smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Level 3 involves full upper body contact," she explained, releasing his face and beginning to unfasten the top of her uniform. "The sensors will need to be repositioned." Daniel's heart rate spiked as he watched her reveal the silver-patterned skin of her shoulders and torso. She stopped at a point that would be considered modest by human standards, but still exposed far more of her than he had seen outside the heat chamber. "I'll need to adjust your sensors as well," she said, rising from her chair and approaching him. As she leaned over him, her fingers working deftly to reposition the monitoring pads on his chest, she whispered words too soft for Rainey to hear. "Follow my lead. Trust me." Before he could respond, she had returned to her chair, reclining it further so that it was almost horizontal. Daniel's chair automatically adjusted to match, bringing them face to face, now just inches apart. "Extend your arms," she instructed, reaching toward him. As their upper bodies connected, chest to chest, arms encircling each other, the energy between them surged dramatically. Daniel gasped at the intensity of it, a sensation like electricity, but pleasurable rather than painful, spreading from every point of contact. On the monitors, The waveforms snapped together, nearly indistinguishable now as they pulsed in perfect synchrony. 70% efficiency, Rainey reported, her voice tight. 75, 80. Sistema's face was so close to Daniel's that he could feel her breath against his lips. Her violet eyes had darkened, pupils dilated. "Can you feel it?" she whispered. "The harmony between us?" He nodded, unable to find words for what he was experiencing. It went beyond physical sensation, beyond the simple pleasure of holding another person. It felt like finding a piece of himself he hadn't known was missing, like coming home to a place he'd never been. "Synchronization approaching optimal levels," Rainey announced, a note of alarm creeping into her voice. "Biosignatures are beginning to merge. This is unprecedented for a human subject." Sistema's arms tightened around Daniel, drawing him even closer. "Now," she breathed against his ear. "We show her what's really possible." Before he could question her meaning, she shifted slightly and pressed her lips to his. Unlike their previous kisses, the desperate connection in the heat chamber, or the gentle exploration in his quarters, this one was deliberate, passionate, acclaiming. The effect on their biosynchronization was immediate and dramatic. The waveforms on the screen merged completely, becoming a single pulsing line of brilliant purple light. The numerical readouts spiked so high that warning indicators began to flash. 90%! Rainey's voice rose sharply. 95! This is impossible. Human physiology cannot sustain this level of synchronization. But Daniel felt no strain, no discomfort. If anything, he felt more alive, more present in his body than he ever had before. The energy flowing between him and Sistema had become a feedback loop, each of them drawing strength from the other and returning it amplified. When they finally broke the kiss, both breathing heavily, he saw that the silver patterns on Sistema's skin were glowing faintly, pulsing in time with their shared heartbeat. 100% synchronization, Rainey announced, her voice hollow with shock. Full biosignature integration achieved and stabilized. Sistema smiled at Daniel, a private expression of triumph and joy. "It appears," she said, loud enough for her sister to hear, "that size is indeed not the determining factor in compatibility." The pointed reference to Rainey's earlier dismissal of him as too small was not lost on anyone in the room. Daniel felt a surge of satisfaction at the visible flinch it produced in the observer. "This concludes today's trial," Sistema declared, slowly disengaging from Daniel's embrace. As they separated, the waveforms on the screen gradually split back into two distinct patterns, though they continued to pulse in harmony. "The data will require extensive analysis before we proceed further." Rainey's face had gone completely blank, her professional mask firmly in place. "I will prepare the preliminary report," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Will you be requiring the subject for additional tests today?" Sistema shook her head. "No. Daniel has earned a period of rest and recovery. Please ensure he has access to the recreational facilities for the remainder of the day." The request, or rather, command, clearly surprised both Rainey and Daniel. In 6 weeks, he had never been allowed anywhere but his quarters and the laboratory. "The recreational sector is not secure for unescorted subjects," Rainey objected. "Then provide an escort," Sistema countered smoothly. "Or have you forgotten that as of yesterday, Daniel's contract status changed to voluntary participant? He is entitled to standard amenities." The sisters stared at each other, another silent battle of wills playing out between them. Finally, Rainey inclined her head slightly. "As you wish, lead analyst. I will arrange for appropriate security measures." As she turned to leave the laboratory, presumably to make these arrangements, Sistema approached Daniel once more, under the pretense of removing his monitoring sensors. She leaned close to his ear. "Meet me on the observation deck at midnight," she whispered. "There's something you need to see." Before he could ask for clarification, she straightened up and spoke in her normal tone. "You'll find the recreational facilities quite adequate. I think there's a viewing area that offers quite spectacular vistas of the Valaran landscape." Daniel nodded, playing along with the casual conversation. "I look forward to it. 6 weeks of the same four walls has been limiting." "Indeed," she smiled professionally. "Enjoy your free time, Daniel. You've earned it." The rest of the day passed in a strange blur of new experiences. True to Sistema's word, Daniel was escorted to the station's recreational sector, a large, open space with garden areas, comfortable seating, and massive windows that looked out onto the alien landscape of Valara. For the first time since his arrival, he saw the world beyond the station's walls. Valara was a planet of stark contrasts, vast crystalline plains that shimmered under the light of its two suns, punctuated by towering rock formations that resembled massive, twisted sculptures. The horizon glowed with an perpetual aurora, ribbons of green and violet light dancing against the pale sky. It was beautiful in an alien, unsettling way. No wonder the Velmarans had evolved differently here. Everything about this world seemed designed to push life to its extremes. Throughout the day, he was aware of being watched, not just by the security personnel assigned to him, but by the other researchers who moved through the recreational area. Word of the morning's unprecedented trial results had clearly spread. He caught them staring, whispering behind their hands, some with expressions of scientific curiosity, others with undisguised disdain. He wondered how many of them shared Rainey's view of humans as inherently inferior, useful only as research subjects, and how many might be open to Sistema's more egalitarian approach. As evening approached, he was returned to his quarters, which he now realized were in a completely different section of the station than he had thought. The walk back took them through areas he had never seen before, laboratories where other research was being conducted, living quarters for the Velmaran scientists, communal dining areas. It was as though a curtain had been pulled back, revealing the true scope of the station and his place within it. He had been kept isolated, restricted to a tiny portion of this vast complex, unable to understand the context of his situation. But that was changing now. Whatever had happened between him and Sistema had shifted the balance of power, had transformed him from a passive subject to an active participant in his own story. When midnight approached, he found his door unlocked, another sign of his changed status. He slipped out quietly, following the directions to the observation deck that he had memorized from the station maps in the recreational area. The corridors were dimly lit for the night cycle, and he encountered no one as he made his way upward through the levels of the station. Finally, he reached a spiral staircase that led to a circular room at the very top of the complex. The observation deck was a marvel of engineering, a transparent dome that offered an unobstructed view of the Valaran night sky. Above him stretched a canvas of stars, unlike any he had seen on Earth. Constellations utterly foreign to human eyes, punctuated by the swirling ribbons of the aurora that never fully faded. Sistema stood at the center of the dome, her silver-white hair unbound for the first time since he'd known her, falling in waves down her back. She had abandoned her uniform entirely, dressed instead in flowing garments of some shimmering material that caught the starlight and reflected it like water. She turned as he approached, and the smile that bloomed on her face was without reservation or professional distance. "You came. Did you doubt I would?" he asked, moving to stand beside her. "No," she admitted. "Not after what we shared today." They stood in silence for a moment, gazing up at the alien sky. Finally, Daniel asked the question that had been burning in his mind since their first real connection in the heat chamber. "What happens now, Sistema? Where does this research of yours lead?" She turned to face him, fully, her expression serious. "That depends on what we choose to make of it," The data we've gathered proves that humans and Velmerans can form bonds as deep and meaningful as any within our own species. But data alone doesn't change minds or hearts. You're talking about more than just science now, Daniel observed. Yes, she nodded. I'm talking about the future of both our peoples. For generations, Velmerans have believed ourselves to be evolved beyond our human ancestors, superior in every meaningful way. We've built our society on that belief, justified our policies of separation and study rather than integration and exchange. And now you've proven that we're not so different after all, Daniel said. That we can connect on the most fundamental level. Exactly. Her eyes shone with passionate conviction. Imagine what could be possible if we approached each other as equals, as potential partners rather than subjects and researchers. The exchange of knowledge, of culture, of perspective. It could transform both our societies. Daniel considered this vision, both its promise and its challenges. Not everyone will welcome that transformation. Rainey certainly doesn't seem thrilled about it. Sistema's expression softened at the mention of her sister. Rainey has spent her entire career enforcing the boundaries between our species. Her identity, her sense of purpose, is wrapped up in maintaining those distinctions. Of course, she resists evidence that challenges her worldview. But you think she can change? I know she can, Sistema said with quiet certainty. I saw it in her face today, when our biosignatures merged completely. Beneath the shock and the denial, there was wonder. And where there's wonder, there's the potential for growth. Daniel wasn't as confident, but he appreciated Sistema's optimism. And what about us? He asked, moving closer to her. Where do we fit into this grand vision of interspecies harmony? She reached for his hand, twining her fingers with his. The now familiar energy began to flow between them, gentler than during the formal trials, but no less real. We are the proof of concept, she said simply. The living evidence that connection across our differences is not just possible, but powerful. What we choose to make of our personal bond is up to us, but its existence alone changes everything. Daniel raised their joined hands, studying the contrast between his skin and hers, the ordinary human tone against the silver-patterned luminescence of Velmeran physiology. Different, yes, but complementary, perhaps even stronger together than apart. I was supposed to leave tomorrow, he reminded her. My contract is fulfilled. I could go back to Earth, back to my life there. Is that what you want? She asked, her voice carefully neutral, though he could feel a tremor of emotion through their connected hands. He looked at her for a long moment. This woman who had been his captor, his researcher, and now something far more complex and meaningful. Then he gazed out at the alien landscape of Valara, a world he was only beginning to understand. I think, he said slowly, that I'm not finished discovering what's possible here. With you, with this research, with whatever comes next. The relief and joy that flooded through their connection told him everything he needed to know about her feelings on the matter. She stepped closer, her free hand coming up to touch his face. Stay, she said simply. Help me change the way our people see each other, starting with my sister. As if summoned by her words, the door to the observation deck slid open. Rainey stood there, her tall frame silhouetted against the corridor lights behind her. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Rainey stepped forward, into the starlight that filled the dome. I thought I might find you here, she said, addressing her sister rather than Daniel. When I checked your quarters and found them empty. Daniel tensed, expecting a confrontation, but Sistema's hand in his remained relaxed. Join us, Rainey, she invited. The aurora is particularly beautiful tonight. Rainey hesitated, then moved further into the dome, keeping a careful distance from the pair. "I've completed the preliminary analysis of today's trial data," she said, her voice professionally detached. "The results are compelling." "And," Sistema prompted gently. "And I have questions," Rainey admitted. "Many questions that our current protocols are inadequate to address." Coming from Rainey, this was as close to a concession as they were likely to get. Sistema squeezed Daniel's hand in silent triumph before releasing it and moving toward her sister. "Perhaps it's time we develop new protocols," she suggested. "Ones that acknowledge the full potential of human-Velmuran interaction." Rainey's gaze flickered to Daniel, then back to her sister. "You look different," she observed suddenly, the personal observation breaking through her scientific demeanor. Sistema smiled. "How so?" "Less contained," Rainey said, struggling to articulate what she was seeing. "More present." "That's what happens when you allow yourself to truly connect with another being," Sistema said gently. "You become more fully yourself, not less." Rainey didn't respond directly to this, but neither did she dismiss it outright. Instead, she looked at Daniel with new consideration in her eyes. "You've altered my sister," she said simply, "in ways I don't yet understand." Daniel met her gaze steadily. "I think we've altered each other," he corrected. "That's what real connection does." A long silence followed, filled only by the soft hum of the station systems and the vast, star-scattered emptiness beyond the dome. Then, with a decisive movement, Rainey approached the central console of the observation deck and activated a control panel. "I'm authorizing an expansion of the research parameters," she announced. "Beginning tomorrow, we will document the full spectrum of biosynchronicity effects, including the psycho-emotional components that our previous protocols neglected." It was a scientific way of acknowledging the validity of what had developed between Daniel and Sistema. Not a personal endorsement, perhaps, but a professional one. For now, that was enough. Sistema crossed to her sister and, in a gesture that clearly surprised Rainey, embraced her briefly. "Thank you," she said quietly. Rainey stiffened momentarily, then relaxed slightly. "The data compels us to adapt our approach," she said, but there was a softening in her voice that belied the clinical language. When they separated, Rainey glanced between Sistema and Daniel, with a new awareness in her eyes. "He's still too small," she said, but the words held none of their former dismissal. Instead, there was a hint of wry acceptance, perhaps even the beginnings of respect. Sistema laughed, the sound bright and free in the dome's perfect acoustics. "Size, my dear sister, has proven to be entirely irrelevant to compatibility." Daniel stepped forward to join the sisters, feeling for the first time like something approaching an equal, rather than a specimen. Together, the three of them turned to gaze out at the crystalline plains of Valara, illuminated by starlight and the dancing aurora above. In that moment, standing between the two Velmuran women who had begun as his captors and become something far more complex, Daniel understood that he stood at the threshold of something genuinely new, not just for himself, but potentially for two species that had viewed each other across a gulf of assumption and prejudice for too long. Whatever came next, whether further research, deeper bonds, or unforeseen challenges, would be faced not as subject and researchers, but as partners in discovery. And that, perhaps, was the most profound result of all their trials. Sistema's hand found his again, the energy flowing between them as natural now as breathing. On his other side, after a moment's hesitation, Rainey moved closer, not touching but present, observing with new eyes. Above them, the stars of an alien sky continued their ancient patterns, indifferent to the small dramas of the beings below. But in that sterile research station, on a world far from Earth, something had changed. A boundary crossed, a connection forged, a future reimagined. It had begun with a dismissal, He's too small. It had transformed through discovery and courage, and the simple, profound power of genuine connection. And now, as morning approached, painting the horizon with the first rays of Valara's twin suns, it promised something none of them had anticipated when they began this journey. A new understanding, not just of their biological compatibility, but of their shared humanity. For in the end, that was what Sistema had found in Daniel, and what Rainey was beginning to glimpse as well. Not just a suitable research subject, but a reflection of the core of themselves, the essence that transcended the genetic modifications and evolutionary divergence that had separated their species. In his smallness, they had discovered something vast. In his difference, they had found profound similarity. And in the space between them, human and Velmarin, subject and researcher, man and woman, they had created something entirely new, a connection that defied classification and opened doors none of them had known existed. As the first full light of day spilled across the observation deck, Daniel knew with complete certainty that he would not be returning to Earth tomorrow, or perhaps ever. His place was here now, helping to bridge worlds that had been separate for too long, forging connections that could transform both species. And perhaps, in time, even Rainey would come to truly understand what her sister had discovered in the arms of a human who had once been dismissed as too small. That the measure of compatibility lay, not in physical stature or genetic markers, but in the capacity to see beyond difference to the shared essence beneath. It was a beginning. This moment of three figures, silhouetted against the Valaran dawn. A beginning, born from an ending. The conclusion of one kind of research, and the commencement of another. More profound investigation into the possibilities that existed when beings chose connection over separation, understanding over assumption, love over protocol. And as the new day dawned on Valara, that beginning held all the promise of worlds transforming, one heart at a time.